In 1775, the shot heard round the world marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. 2 years later, many events conspired to produce the most fateful period in the revolutionary history of the village that is now known as New Bedford, Massachusetts. The British controlled every major harbor, from the Carolinas to Maine. However, they were constantly being harassed by colonial privateers who slipped easily in and out of Bedford Harbor. Privateers, private men of war. And that's exactly what these elusive craft were. Privately owned vessels, often former whaling ships and their crews, that had been commissioned by the Congress to capture and loot enemy ships. During the course of the war, the British lost more than $18 million worth of ships and goods. In August 1778, British General Charles Grey led a raid on New London, Connecticut to punish the citizens harboring these private vessels. The entire village, along with wharf and warehouses, was destroyed with the flames visible for nearly 100 miles. Word quietly spread of the devastation, and the citizens of Bedford lived in fear and trepidation of similar retaliation. They began preparing for the impending crisis. The construction of a fort on the Fairhaven side of the harbor had begun in 1775. This natural stronghold, now called Fort Phoenix, was bolstered with 11 cannon. The militia was mustered. The Minutemen gathered their forces. The majority of these troops were sent, however, to Tiverton, Rhode Island, anticipating Gray's next target would be there, leaving only a token force of patriots left to guard Bedford Harbor. This proved to be a fateful error, as the British, led by General Gray, made their way directly to Bedford Harbor. Samuel Adams once said in 1768 that military power will never awe a sensible American tamely to surrender his liberty. The events that occurred in the 15 years following that statement proved he was right. Three Tories, loyal to the Crown, had been run out of town earlier in the summer. Eldade Tupper, Joe Castle, and Richard Sherman naturally were bitter about their estrangement and went to the British to offer their services. Besides being loyal to the king, two of the three were also harbor pilots of some skill and agreed to lead Gray and his men in their conquest of the Bedford area. Their first request was to punish the Aiken family who had betrayed them and forced them out of town. And so their wishes came true, as the British troops landed at Padenarum and made their way to the Aiken house that dreadful weekend. After burning a boat belonging to Aiken, the Redcoat Regiment marched to the door of a house now located at 359 Elm Street, and were met by a housekeeper who staunchly refused their demands and answered with a bucket of water. This succeeded in fanning the flames of the British officer's wrath, who proceeded to forcefully enter the house in search of other members of the family. The woman housekeeper was taken prisoner. This action was by no means unnoticed, as some patriots were hiding in nearby thickets waiting for their chance. When a young man tried to escape from the house, the British fired in his direction, but only to have their fire returned by lurking snipers. And during the chaos that followed, the prisoner escaped, thus adding to the frustration of the English commander. A further search of the house produced nothing, and so it was ransacked and burned. Terror struck the hearts of the patriots as they remembered the horror stories of New London and feared for their lives and properties. The British reboarded their ships that evening, not in retreat, but on their next target, Bedford Harbor. In the early afternoon of the next day, Saturday, September 9th, the British ships began to appear in the distance off Clark's Cove. The alarm was sounded from the Fairhaven battery on the mainland. And the small but dedicated group of Continental soldiers and their meager artillery were summoned to Clark's Point on the Bedford shore. An appalling barrage from the ship's cannons assaulted the beach. Yet the brave men on shore returned with fire with cannon and musket until it was necessary to retreat as the British landing force overwhelmed them. A small but brave band of martyrs held the beach as long as they were able to allow time enough to muster the militiamen from surrounding areas. Their death knell was sounded by the silence of the ship's cannons as the British stepped foot onto the shores of Bedford village. Very quickly, the stunning red-coated marching unit was called to attention and began their march up the county road, now County Street, that was to be marked with bonfires and blood. Leading the assault was Captain John Andre and his helpers, the three Tories who were quick to point out homes belonging to known Patriot leaders. Meanwhile, at many homes along that fateful route, the Saturday routine had been going on. Pork and beans were simmering for dinner. Brown bread was in the oven. When the alarm sounded that the British were coming, the inhabitants of one household fled, leaving their Saturday night meal on the stove. This proved to be an inadvertent trap for a hungry patriot named Lieutenant William Gordon of the Boston Artillery Train. Lieutenant Gordon, bored and tired of waiting for the Redcoats, answered the call of his stomach and consumed a large portion of that meal, only to be taken by surprise by Captain Andre and his men for dessert. He was taken prisoner and sent to the rear of the British column, where he was able to jump over a wall and escape. Another frustration, for the British fanned their furor and determination to punish the rebels once and for all. Lieutenant Gordon was able to rejoin his unit and to help them position the cannon at strategic locations along the way, where they were able to slow down the march and generally harass His Majesty's troops. Several of the British were wounded during these exchanges, and the crafty snipers were able to escape. The Redcoats were marching up County Road and stopped at the intersection of North Street. 3 unsuspecting seamen were walking up the hill from the waterfront, carrying their muskets in an attempt to escape from the advancing forces of the King. The British spotted them first and immediately opened fire, thinking that they were the previous sniper party. The young seamen had no chance to explain their position as the British quickly advanced with fixed bayonets and proceeded to take out all their anger and wrath on the 3 in a brutal mass murder. In Bedford village, women, children, both were frantically trying to evacuate with their lives and as many possessions as they could. Several of the men, along with the militia officer, refused to be pushed from their homes and decided to make a stand to allow their families more time to escape. The British continued their march toward McPherson's Wharf at Belleville, just south of the present Mullins Bridge, and offered the resistance group a chance to surrender. Their refusal infuriated the British commander, who ordered the village and all the warehouses and ships on the wharf to be burned. The Americans answered with a burst of musket fire. They were forced to flee during the ensuing fighting. Very few patriots were able to escape the Holocaust that resulted in almost total destruction of McPherson's Wharf and the once peaceful and prosperous village of Bedford. Across the harbor at Fairhaven, now known as Fort Phoenix, hearts grew weak as the Americans watched the sky smeared with flames and the smoke that signified the echo of yet another New London incident. However, their belief in their cause and dedication to the principles of liberty strengthened their spirits as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation at their stronghold. With McPherson's wharf completely destroyed by fire, the ravaging troops of the king continued to move northward along Belleville Avenue towards the head of the river. At what is now Tarleton Hill Road, the British were suddenly surprised by the sight of the rebel cannon, which they had been pursuing all day. This big gun and a large number of militiamen were defending the river crossing, but because of superior forces and outnumbering cannon, the British artillery were able to silence the rebel gun. But the militia continued their defense with musket fire. During this intense action, there were several casualties. The most grievous to the Americans was a young artillery officer, Lieutenant James Metcalf. He was mortally wounded. The Patriots retreated slowly and then fled in all directions on the Fairhaven side of the river, now Acushnet. Throughout this day of devastation, bonfires and blood were not quite enough retribution for the three Tories. Several times along the march, they were quick to point out homes belonging to known American sympathizers. In keeping with their request, the British barged into the home of Colonel Walter Spooner, and he was immediately placed in irons while his lady friend was paraded above the area for all to mock. A neighbor who seemed to approve of this action invited the English officers in for a cup of tea, which they willingly accepted. That evening, the British troops camped near the river crossing where they rested in anticipation of resuming their destructive drive the following morning. As the campfires flowed and flickered on both sleeping armies, there were probably many dreams. Dreams of horror, dreams of death, of loss, of fear, and probably of home and loved ones near warm fireplaces waiting and wondering when it would all be over. On Sunday, September 10th, the British continued their march toward Fort Phoenix while the Americans resisted constantly along the way. The Tories also had their fun, as several Patriot homes were sacked and plundered and citizens abused. The Tories pointed out a house belonging to Judge Edward Pope. Pope and his family were famous leaders in the Revolution. Mr. Pope was immediately placed in irons and sent to the rear of the column with Colonel Spooner. Farther down South Main Street, the English spotted a young boy running from a house carrying some of the family valuables. When they chased the youth, they were met with a barrage of musket fire from snipers hiding in the bushes beside the road. Violent fire returned and ensued from the British artillery following the search. No rebels were found. Foiled again. At the approach of the home of Bartholomew West, the Tories announced that Mr. West had two sons extremely active in the Continental movements who were secretly members of the American Army. The forceful entry followed only to reveal a loyal servant named Hannah Sogg, who refused to cooperate. Captain Andre insisted upon a thorough search and threatened the household. The only person in the building was the invalid Mr. West, who was constantly protected by his housekeeper, who gently helped him vacate his room. When Captain Andre ordered a noose around West's neck, the old man cried for his Bible. The sadistic officer realized the family heirloom meant more to him than his life, and so took that treasured book as a prize of war, and left the old man shaken and in tears, watching his house burn. Almost as if the Americans had witnessed the cruel scene, they met the British with more sniper fire shortly around the next bend. Return fire and another search failed to reveal any of the elusive fighters. Infuriated and frustrated by their vanishing enemies, the Redcoats were quick to terrorize the home of Bartholomew Tabor, located at 88 Hedge Street. Once again, the Tories had exposed them as a stronghold of colonial support. Boldly, Tabor refused to be intimidated and stood his ground despite threats of hanging and death. Mrs. Tabor was found hiding in the house, and she refused to divulge the location of the family valuables. But finally, she weakened to save her husband and gave the soldiers her silver. Encouraged by their success with the Tabors, the British continued their destructive march south, and while doing so, burned the house belonging to the Wood family. The Tories were beginning to get their revenge. The British continued their march down to the wharf area, where they boarded their awaiting ships for the final assaults against this harbor. The Americans, armed with cannon and muskets, positioned themselves in and about the area of the fort in anticipation of a full-scale assault against that position by the superior forces of British troops under the command of the no-flint General Gray. The final events in the Battle of Bedford Harbor took place at this stronghold. Last refuge of the Patriots of Bedford Harbor. Finally, following a fierce engagement between the British and American forces, Major Israel Fearing of the Wareham Militia arrived and drove the ravaging British troops back to their barges and waiting ships in the harbor, thus saving the town from further destruction at the hands of the invading Redcoats. This historic action is documented even today at Fort Phoenix, located in the town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Although the attack on Bedford Harbor and places adjacent, including Fort Phoenix, was not a deciding factor in our struggle for independence, the zeal and spirit by which the inhabitants of this community reacted was undoubtedly and unquestionably the motivating force that caused the founding of a new nation, free of tyranny and suppression. Major General Charles Gray, the no-flint general, arrived in America with Lieutenant General William Howe in 1775. He rose gloriously through the ranks while in America, being appointed Commander-in-Chief in North America in 1783. He was later elevated to the rank of full general in 1795. He was raised to the peerage in 1801 and made Earl in 1806. He died November 14, 1807, near his seat at Alnwick, Northumberland, England. Captain John Andre, the young British officer who led the raid on Bedford Harbor, drew the attention of the Supreme British Commander and was appointed Adjutant General to Clinton. However, 2 years after the raid at Bedford, Andre, who was only 29 years old, was captured and later hanged for his complicity with the American General Benedict Arnold for the secretly planned takeover of the American stronghold fortress at West Point, New York. He was hanged and buried at Tappan, New York, on October 2nd, 1780. West's family Bible, which was taken by the British troops, notably the 46th Regiment, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry, following the raid of Bedford Harbor. It accompanied the 46th Regiment in many battles, only to fall back into American hands, but somehow was again recaptured by the British. It later crisscrossed the Atlantic several times, where it again was captured. However, this time at the hands of the French in the West Indies. It was later returned to the 46th Regiment as a returned prize of war, where it found a permanent home in the officers' mess of the 46th Regiment, lying on a silver platter under a glass as a reminder of the glorious endeavors of that regiment. Colonel Walter Spooner and Judge Edward Pope, who were taken prisoners during the raid, were later released prior to the British departing the harbor. Both men continued on as prominent citizens, contributing to and building the town into the reputable community which is symbolic of today. Lieutenant James Metcalf, while directing his company of Continental Artillery at the river crossing, died from wounds received from close British fire. The following day, after the departure of the British, Metcalf, who was from Boston, was buried in the Hilltop Cemetery in Acushnet Village near the main road with full military honors. Lieutenant William Gordon of the Boston Artillery Train was the first prisoner taken by the British. However, he was able to escape and rejoin his company. In a moment of valor, his company continually exchanged volley with the British field pieces. He held many commissions, his first awarded him by the renowned patriot John Hancock. His first command was an artillery company, which at one time was commanded by the now famous Paul Revere. Following the war, Gordon decided to remain in Dartmouth. He died at a ripe old age and is buried in the old Revolutionary plot in the Acushnet Cemetery. Captain Timothy Ingram, the young commander of the Fairhaven redoubt, Fort Phoenix, rallied his men in the face of an overwhelming force of enemy troops. At the sight of the invading armada, Captain Ingram sent riders in all directions to muster the militia and warned the inhabitants of the impending danger. He, like Lieutenant Gordon, decided to remain in Dartmouth, where he died following a full and satisfying life. He was laid to rest in the old precinct cemetery on 2nd Street in New Bedford. As an added note, his grandson served in the Army during the American Civil War with the rank of general. The story of the attack of Bedford Harbor, as just witnessed, was reenacted by hundreds of recreated American, Hessian, and British troops in the spirit of living history. The actual sequence of events were altered somewhat in order of practicality in portraying this notable event. To all who assisted in the reenactment itself, and to the many who assisted otherwise, we shall be eternally grateful.